He pulled the shotgun only after they crossed his fence. 3 black SUVs, bright vests, and polished shoes, on land that had been in his family for 70 years. One of them dared to touch his shoulder. Jonas Hale looked down, calm as stone, and said, "Don't." Then came the sound. Chalk, cold, final. That's when they turned pale and ran. But this wasn't some outlaw story. Jonas was a veteran, 46, quiet, steady, the kind of man who once built fences with his bare hands and buried brothers under foreign skies. He wanted peace. Instead, they called him violent. They called him insane. And the town believed it. They didn't see the forged maps. They didn't see the cameras in the trees. They didn't see how far greed can reach when it hides behind a smile. Until one night, a young man knocked on his door, trembling, whispering, "I have proof." From that moment, the story changed. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens. It comes with truth and the courage to stand your ground. Before we begin, hit like, share this story, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because I want to know how far this story of one man's truth can travel across the world. The wind was still asleep when the first light touched the fields. The kind of light that crept over the hills like a prayer, slow and gentle, waking up the world one breath at a time. You could hear the frost melt on the fence wire, the faint hum of life beneath the soil. And somewhere between that silence and the smell of cedar, the story began. Jonas Hale stood at the edge of his land with both hands wrapped around a strand of barbed wire, tightening what the last storm had torn apart. His gloves were old, cracked leather, blackened at the fingertips, but his movements carried a precision that came from years of repetition. Every pull of the wire was steady, deliberate, the same rhythm that had guided him through war and loss. The air was sharp enough to bite. Each breath turned into mist and drifted toward the golden horizon. Behind him, Bear followed in measured steps, tail low, ears flicking at every small sound. The dog's fur shimmered under the thin light, silver gray with darker shadows running down his spine. His paws pressed quiet prints into the frost, loyal and alert. Together they moved through the morning as if time itself respected their silence. Jonas had lived alone for years, though alone never quite captured the truth. There was the hum of the windmill by the barn, the groan of old wood as the house settled into another winter, and Bear's steady breathing at the foot of his bed. That was enough for him. The army had taught him to live with less noise, less comfort, less expectation. Peace was something you had to earn, and he'd paid for it in places no map could name. The coffee on the porch rail had gone cold by the time he looked up and saw it, the thin line carved into the dirt road, clean and fresh, like a wound that hadn't stopped bleeding. He crouched, ran a gloved thumb along the groove. Not a ranch truck. The tread was wide, smooth, and new. Somewhere nearby, the faint smell of gasoline lingered where it didn't belong. He stood there a long moment, eyes narrowing at the southern ridge. The land stretched out before him, endless and familiar. To anyone else, it would look the same as it always had, just fences, brush, and open pasture. But Jonas knew every inch of it, every scar, every sound. Something had changed. Bear's ears twitched. A low growl rose from his chest, quiet but certain. Jonas followed the dog's gaze toward the main gate. There they were, 3 figures standing just beyond the boundary line. One woman in a pale coat, 2 men in crisp shirts and polished shoes that gleamed even under the dirt-gray sky. They didn't fit here. Their posture was too stiff, their smiles too wide. Each held a clipboard, pages fluttering slightly in the breeze like white flags of false courtesy. Jonas didn't move closer. He didn't need to. The distance between them spoke loud enough. From where he stood, he could see the woman's lips move, some pleasantry about opportunity, development, progress, words that meant nothing out here. He didn't answer. He simply adjusted his gloves and leaned against the fence post, the kind of gesture that was both polite and final. The woman hesitated, exchanged a glance with one of her men, then stepped forward half a pace. Her shoes sank a fraction into the mud and she stopped. That was as far as she dared. Jonas's eyes met hers. He didn't glare. He just watched, calm, unreadable, the sort of look that made even confident people forget what they'd planned to say. Bear stood beside him, unmoving but tense, the fur along his back lifting like grass before a storm. After a few seconds too long, the strangers retreated. The woman said something over her shoulder, sharp, clipped, frustrated, and they turned back toward the shiny black SUV waiting on the roadside. The engine roared to life, a foreign sound in the quiet of the countryside, and the vehicle rolled away in a cloud of pale dust. Jonas stayed still until the last echo of tires disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did he breathe out, slow and measured. He walked back toward the porch, boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. The untouched coffee waited, surface dark, catching a glint of sunlight. He took a sip anyway. It was cold, bitter, metallic. Something sacred had been touched. He didn't know exactly what yet, but he could feel it, the same way soldiers feel the air change before the first shot. The land was too quiet now, not peaceful, empty. The kind of empty that follows after someone crosses a line they shouldn't have crossed. He ran a hand through Bear's fur. The dog leaned closer, pressing his head against Jonas's leg, eyes trained on the horizon. "Easy," Jonas murmured, though the word carried no ease in it. From the barn came the distant creak of old hinges, the moan of wood expanding under the sun. A hawk circled above, calling once, before vanishing into the glare. The ranch looked ordinary again, just fences and grass and the slow crawl of daylight. But beneath that calm, something restless moved. Jonas walked back toward the fence just to look once more. The tire tracks were still there, gleaming faintly where the frost had melted. He could almost hear the sound of them, rubber grinding against his soil, a reminder that the world outside his gate had started inching closer. He picked up a handful of dirt, let it sift through his fingers, dry, fine, and cold. It fell back to the ground, like time slipping through a man's grasp. "Not today," he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, maybe just to the land itself. Bear's head lifted again, ears turning toward the far field. The low rumble in his throat was steady this time, no warning, just recognition. Jonas followed his gaze. Down near the far fence line, the faint glimmer of something metallic caught the sun. A piece of paper maybe, or another marker. It fluttered once, then stilled. The air seemed to hold its breath. Jonas adjusted his jacket, the old army green faded by decades of weather and work. The patch on the sleeve, an American flag worn but proud, had started to fray. He traced the edge of it absently, as if grounding himself in something that couldn't be taken. The horizon stretched quiet and golden again, but there was a pulse beneath it, a rhythm out of sync with the land he knew. He could feel it through his boots, through the wind, through the way Bear's breathing shifted to something heavier. Jonas turned toward the house. The sky was warming, the frost retreating, the day beginning like any other. But peace has a way of thinning before it breaks, and he could sense the crack forming, invisible but certain. He reached the porch and paused. From here, he could see everything. The barn, the pastures, the long dirt road leading out toward the new subdivision on the horizon. The roofs there gleamed like coins under the morning sun. He'd ignored them for months, believing distance was enough. But distance, he was learning, was only another kind of silence. Bear settled at his feet, head on his paws, eyes never leaving the road. The two of them stayed like that for a long while, watching the light climb and the wind pick up, carrying with it the scent of cedar and something else, something faintly sour, like greed. Somewhere beyond the gate, an engine coughed once, then died. Jonas didn't move. He didn't have to. The message had already been sent. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the frost had vanished, but the feeling hadn't. A storm was building, not in the clouds, but in the kind of quiet that comes before a man is forced to defend what's his. Jonas lifted his coffee again. The bitter taste lingered, sharp and grounding. Bear raised his head, a single low growl rolling from his chest. Jonas didn't look at him this time. He didn't need to. He already knew. The fight was coming. And it wouldn't be fought on foreign soil this time. The sun had burned its way through the morning chill, and the land now shimmered under a thin veil of heat. Dust lifted from the dry road in lazy spirals, glowing pale gold under the noonday light. Jonas Hale stood near the barn, sleeves rolled, a bucket in one hand, when the distant hum of an engine cut through the calm. It wasn't the uneven rhythm of a pickup or a tractor. This was smoother, foreign, deliberate. A black SUV crested the ridge and rolled down the dirt road like a dark beetle crossing sacred ground. Jonas watched in silence as it came closer, tires whispering over the gravel. The vehicle stopped near the gate, and for a moment the air seemed to hold its breath. Then the doors opened in perfect sync. The first to step out was a woman, mid-40s perhaps, tall and meticulously composed. Her navy suit looked pressed by the morning sun itself, and the heels of her shoes sank into the soft dirt as though the earth resented her presence. Her hair was a polished gold, pulled tight into a twist that didn't dare move with the wind. A subtle scent, something synthetic and expensive, hung around her as she walked. Behind her followed two men in their 30s, both built like office walls, upright, immovable, cold. Their ties fluttered faintly, their faces smooth and unreadable. They didn't look around. Their eyes were fixed ahead, scanning Jonas and the open land behind him as if they already owned it. "Mr. Hale," the woman called, her voice calm, trained, coated in that gentle authority that sells false kindness. She rested one manicured hand on the gatepost, smiling like she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror. "Your southern acres are the missing piece for our new community. We're offering $1.8 million. Jonas didn't move. Bear padded to his side, tail low, the fur on his back lifting with each syllable. The woman's tone was smooth, her words practiced, like a pianist playing notes she no longer felt. Behind her, the two men shifted their weight slightly, hands folded in front, waiting for the signature that hadn't yet been offered. He looked at her the way a man looks at a storm cloud, measuring its weight, its distance, its intent. The same eyes that had watched dust rise over battlefields now studied this polished stranger with quiet precision. A veteran's eyes never unlearned the difference between peace and threat. The wind changed. It carried the faint rattle of the flag hanging on the porch, the smell of cedar and rust, and something colder, the perfume of deceit dressed up as opportunity. Jonas let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of language. "My grandfather built this place," he said finally, his voice low, steady as the ground itself. "Some things aren't for sale." The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They simply landed, soft but with weight enough to leave no doubt. The woman's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly. One of the men, behind her, looked away, studying the horizon as though the hills might offer him a better answer. But professionalism has its armor, and she quickly rebuilt her composure. "We'll follow up," she replied, her tone lighter now, a shade tighter at the edges. She straightened her blazer, turned, and began walking back to the SUV, each step punctuated by the sharp stab of her heels against the earth. Jonas didn't move to open the gate. He didn't wave. He only watched them go, the sleek black vehicle shrinking into the distance, swallowed by the shimmering dust. When the sound of the engine finally faded, the quiet returned, heavier than before. Bear barked once, a low, uncertain sound, not fear, not aggression, something in between. Jonas rested a hand on the dog's neck. "I know," he murmured. "I saw it too." The afternoon wore on slow. Jonas spent it fixing a section of the north fence that had been leaning for weeks. The hammer echoed through the valley, rhythmic, stubborn, but his mind wasn't on the work. It kept circling back to the woman's shoes in the dirt, the way her words had sounded rehearsed, the faint tremor in her smile when he'd refused. He'd seen that look before, in lieutenants giving orders they didn't believe in. By sundown, the horizon was a smear of violet and rust. The barn doors creaked as he shut them, and Bear followed close behind, nose to the ground, uneasy. The quiet of the land had changed. It wasn't rest. It was waiting. Inside the house, Jonas poured himself coffee that had sat too long on the stove. The air smelled of metal and pine oil. He sat by the window, looking out at the fading light. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a lone coyote called, its cry sharp and distant, like a question the night refused to answer. When darkness came, the ranch dissolved into shadows. The only light was the faint red blink of his trail camera, mounted high on the fence post. Jonas had installed it years ago to watch for coyotes and stray cattle, not people. But that night, when he glanced at the small monitor, the screen showed a shape, a flicker of movement at the gate. Headlights, 2, then 4, slow, crawling. The beam shifted, washed over the posts, lingered on the lock. Someone was testing it. Jonas didn't move right away. He watched the light sway, then vanish, then return again, closer. A car door clicked. The air filled with the hum of an idling engine, then went silent. After a long minute, the headlights cut out completely, leaving only the darkness and the soft whistle of the wind through the trees. Bear stiffened. His ears stood, nose twitching, a low growl rumbling in his throat like thunder, too far to fear but too near to ignore. Jonas rose, slow and deliberate, reaching for the old army flashlight that hung by the door. Its metal handle was cool against his palm. He pressed the switch, and the beam sliced through the dark. The light swept across the ground, dirt, grass, wire, until it caught something small and unnatural glinting back. There, just beyond the second post, a thin strip of orange fluttered in the wind. Survey ribbons, bright, plastic, new, inside the fence line. Jonas didn't speak. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly as he followed the line of ribbon to where it disappeared into the brush, each one tied carefully, evenly spaced, deliberate. He turned off the light. The night swallowed them both. Bear pressed against his leg, warm and silent, the only living thing left between him and whatever was moving in the dark. Jonas looked out at the land, his land, sprawling under a sky that no longer felt safe. Somewhere in that darkness, someone had already begun to claim it piece by piece, and though he couldn't see them, he could feel their presence the way a man feels a coming storm in his bones. The ribbons swayed once more in the faint wind, whispering promises that were never meant for men like him. The morning rose cold and clean, sunlight sliding over the hills like a blade over glass. Dew clung to every blade of grass, shining white and fragile in the chill. For a brief moment, everything seemed untouched again, the fences silver with frost, the wind steady, the kind of silence that could make a man forget. But when Jonas Hale stepped outside, the peace cracked underfoot. Fresh tire tracks scarred the dirt road, deep and wet, pressed through the grass like open wounds. The smell of gasoline lingered, sharp and foreign. A section of wire sagged near the eastern fence line, its posts split and leaning. And up near the ridge, idling in the pale light, sat the same black SUV, the one that had promised to follow up. Jonas didn't rush. He never did. He just adjusted his hat, slid his hands into his jacket pockets, and started walking. The gravel shifted under his boots, the only sound besides the low rumble of the vehicle's engine. Bear walked beside him, head low, tail still, a faint growl vibrating in his chest. As they drew closer, the figures came into view. 3 men, all in neon reflective vests, stood in the pasture. They weren't from the county or the electric co-op. Jonas knew every uniform that belonged here. These were private contractors, the kind hired by people who called land property and peace potential. One of them held a clipboard, another carried a tripod with a measuring scope, and the third was tapping on a phone, smiling faintly at something Jonas couldn't see. The man with the clipboard glanced up first. He looked mid-30s, hair slicked back, face too clean for outdoor work. "Morning," he said flatly. Not a greeting, just noise. Jonas stopped a few yards away, the cold wind curling between them. "Private land," he said, voice even, measured, neither threat nor invitation. The man didn't meet his eyes. "Authorized survey," he replied, already turning back to his work. His boots ground small stones into the soil that wasn't his. Bear let out a low sound, something primal and ancient, enough to still the air around them. Jonas didn't reach for him, didn't hush him. A dog knows when words are useless. The man with the tripod moved closer, hammering a small stake into the ground. Jonas watched the wooden post sink into the earth his grandfather had once tilled. The sound echoed like disrespect. "You have papers?" Jonas asked quietly. No answer, only the rhythmic click of a metal latch. He took one more step forward. The second man brushed past him, barely, but enough that Jonas felt the fabric of a bright vest graze his shoulder. It was a small touch, careless and dismissive, but it struck like a spark in dry grass. Something inside him, something that had survived wars, funerals, and long nights alone, went still. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. The old anger stayed coiled where it lived, deep and patient. Without a word, he turned and began walking. Back toward the house, Bear pacing tightly beside him, eyes never leaving the intruders. From the porch, Jonas opened the old wooden cabinet where the smell of oil and dust still carried a memory. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the shotgun his father had left him, a Remington 870 with a walnut stock worn smooth from decades of work and defense. He unwrapped it with the care of a ritual, not a threat. He didn't load it, didn't even reach for the shells. He simply pulled back the slide, chock, once. That single sound rolled across the pasture like thunder breaking the morning open. The men froze where they stood. The one with the clipboard dropped it, papers scattering like startled birds. The one holding the tripod took a step back, then another, his face bleaching pale in the sunlight. No one spoke. Jonas didn't raise the gun. He didn't point it. He just held it across his chest, barrel down, gaze steady. His silence was louder than any warning. "Leave," he said softly. They did. The SUV door slammed, engines revved, and the vehicle tore away from the ridge, spinning dust that hung in the air long after the sound had gone. The papers fluttered near the broken fence, one catching on a thorn bush, flapping in the wind like a surrender flag. Jonas stood there for a while, the shotgun still in his hands, feeling the weight of it, not as a weapon, but as memory. His father had taught him that a gun wasn't for anger, it was for promise, a promise to protect what you loved when no one else would. Bear pressed close against his leg, eyes locked on the horizon. The tension in the dog's body didn't ease, even as the sound of the SUV faded to nothing. Jonas finally lowered the weapon, worked the slide forward again, and set it against the porch railing. His reflection in the metal was small and tired. He could almost hear his father's voice. "Don't aim unless you mean it. Don't fire unless you must." The morning sun climbed higher, turning the frost to steam. The fence still leaned, wires still broken. The trespassers had left, but their presence remained like fingerprints on glass. Jonas walked to the edge of the field again. The tire tracks were deep now, pressed through his soil like a scar he couldn't erase. He crouched, running a hand through the dirt, feeling where their tires had torn into roots, the fragile life underneath crushed by arrogance. "Authorized survey," he muttered under his breath, the words bitter and weightless. From somewhere far down the road came a faint hum. He looked up, squinting into the distance. Dust plumes rose again, 3, maybe 4 shapes moving fast. Not the same SUV this time, lighter vehicles, white and blue. Bear's ears perked, his tail stiffened. The low growl started again, deeper now, vibrating through the air like warning drums. Jonas stood, his hand falling instinctively to the shotgun still resting by the porch. The wind had shifted east, carrying with it a thin, rising sound that didn't belong to the land. Sirens, faint at first, then clearer, cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. Jonas didn't move. He just stood at the fence line, Bear beside him, watching the horizon where the noise grew louder, closer. The sun glinted off something in the distance, metal flashing red and blue. And for the first time that day, Jonas let out a long breath. He had known this was coming. Every man who holds his ground eventually hears the sound of sirens. The fight wasn't coming. It was already here. The morning began with the hum of distant engines. The dust hadn't yet settled on the road when the county cruiser turned onto Jonas Hale's drive, the sunlight glinting off its silver hood. 2 deputies stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the wet clay. The older one moved slower, his face lined from years of work that didn't pay enough, eyes tired but not unkind. The younger one lingered near the car, hand resting on the strap of his vest, cautious. Jonas stood on the porch, unarmed, coffee steaming gently in the cold air. He looked like any man who'd lived too long on his own, calm, measured, no need for explanations. Bear sat by his feet, tail wrapped around his paws, gaze fixed on the newcomers. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the clinking of metal as the older deputy adjusted his badge. "They said you threatened them," the man finally said, his voice somewhere between disbelief and duty. "It wasn't accusation. It was procedure." Jonas nodded once, set his cup down on the railing, and gestured toward the small black camera mounted under the eave. "Play it." The deputy followed him inside. The younger one waited on the porch, eyes darting across the open fields, as if the grass itself might rise to defend its owner. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and coffee, of a life built with patience. Jonas plugged in the small monitor, fingers steady, and let the footage roll. The screen showed what he already knew. 3 men in reflective vests, trespassing without permits. His own figure was calm, unmoving. The shotgun remained lowered, barrel up. No threat, no rage, just boundaries. The sound of the slide echoed through the recording, sharp but measured, followed by the panicked retreat of men unprepared for consequences. When the video ended, the deputy stood quietly for a moment. He rubbed the back of his neck, sighing through his nose. "You're clean, Jonas, but they'll come back." Jonas didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He just picked up his coffee again, the steam now thin and pale. The deputies left, the younger one offering a nod that looked halfway between respect and worry. The cruiser rolled away, leaving only the tire marks curling toward the horizon like a question the land itself couldn't answer. By afternoon, the quiet began to change, not in sound, but in tone. The phone on the wall rang twice, 3 times, then stopped. Later, a friend from town called to say his name was being mentioned online, something about armed intimidation, unstable veteran, local volunteers endangered. The words crawled faster than truth ever could. Within hours, Jonas's face appeared on neighborhood forums, community pages, even a local paper's website. The photo, grainy, pulled from his old ranch listing, showed him holding a tool near the fence. They cropped the handle just enough to make it look like a weapon. Beneath the image, the comments multiplied. "He's dangerous. Someone needs to stop that man. That's what happens when you let them live out there too long." He didn't respond. He didn't know how to fight ghosts wearing digital masks. Bear stayed close that evening, restless, ears twitching at every flicker of light from the road. The air outside had grown electric, the way it does before a storm no radar can see. Night fell heavy. The moon rose behind low clouds, turning the pasture silver and strange. Jonas sat in the dark, no lamps, only the faint glow of the window reflecting his silhouette. The old house creaked like an aging body remembering pain. He watched the horizon, where small flashes broke the stillness. Headlights, pausing, moving, then pausing again. Cars slowed near his gate, stayed long enough for a picture, then moved on. The world was watching a version of him that didn't exist, a phantom built from fear and rumor. Bear whined softly, head on Jonas's knee. He stroked the dog's ear absent-mindedly, eyes never leaving the window. Somewhere far away, a coyote answered the hum of engines with its lonely cry. The land felt smaller that night, and the stars looked further away. The phone buzzed again, once, twice. He almost ignored it, but something in the timing, like hesitation, made him reach for it. "Jonas?" The voice was uncertain, male, mid-30s maybe, breath uneven. "My name's Ethan Brooks. I worked for them." Jonas didn't speak. The static on the line filled the gaps between words. "I have proof," the man said quickly, the urgency rising. "They're lying to you, to everyone. You need to listen." The line cracked, hissed, then steadied just long enough for one last fragment to come through. "They already sold your land 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, full, like the pause before thunder strikes. Jonas stood there in the half-light, phone pressed to his ear, the night pressing back around him. Outside, Bear lifted his head, ears pricked, as if he too could hear something shifting in the dark. The moment a man realizes his home has already been stolen on paper, even as he's still standing on it. The next morning broke under a low iron sky, heavy with the kind of clouds that promised rain but delivered something colder. Jonas Hale drove into town with Bear in the passenger seat, the truck's old engine humming against the emptiness of the road. The town itself still slept, a few lights in the diner windows, a mail truck rolling past the feed store. Behind that same feed store, in the narrow gravel lot where the air smelled of rust and old hay, a man waited. He was younger than Jonas expected, mid-30s, thin from worry rather than hunger, wearing a cheap gray jacket that didn't fit right. His name was Ethan Brooks. He looked like someone who had once believed in systems, in contracts, and clean lines, until he'd seen how easily signatures could ruin a man. His hands trembled as Jonas approached, the breath of his words clouding in the cold air. "I don't have long," Ethan said. His voice cracked at the edges, a man speaking through regret. He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, holding it like something poisonous. Karen Schilling forged the documents, he whispered. She took the developer's deposit. Your land's been sold on paper. Jonas stared at the small piece of metal in Ethan's hand. A thing so small, holding the weight of his family's history, their labor, their graves. He didn't reach for it immediately. He just watched the man, the way his eyes flicked to the alley like a hunted animal's. Finally, he took it. You did the right thing, Jonas said quietly. Ethan's laugh came out hollow. Right doesn't count for much anymore. Rain began to fall then, soft at first, then steady, hissing against the metal roof of the feed store. They stood in it without moving, two men linked by a truth that could destroy them both. That afternoon, Jonas drove straight to Avery Collins, his lawyer, and one of the few people in town who still believed the law could stand taller than greed. Avery was in his 50s, sharp-eyed, clean-cut, the kind of man who kept his words organized and his whiskey hidden. His office smelled of ink, wood polish, and long hours. Jonas handed him the drive without ceremony. Avery inserted it into his laptop, and the screen filled with documents, blueprints, zoning approvals, maps stamped and signed. The names, the dates, the signatures, all there, all wrong. Every file predated by weeks, every permit written before any offer had ever reached Jonas's door. Avery leaned back in his chair, face pale, eyes narrowing. This isn't carelessness, he said. This is orchestration. Jonas said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them was heavier than accusation. While Avery began drafting the paperwork, a different kind of visitor arrived at the ranch that evening. A small sedan pulled up near the gate, headlights dimming as the rain settled into mist. A woman stepped out, late 30s, perhaps early 40s, coat too thin for the cold, hair tied loosely behind her head. She carried no microphone, no camera crew, only a notebook and a look that said she had already read too many lies. Her name was Linda Rowan, an investigative reporter known for quiet persistence. She introduced herself briefly, then stood by the porch without asking to come in. I'm not here for headlines, she said. I'm here for the truth. Jonas studied her for a moment. She reminded him of the medics he'd seen in war zones, steady, tired, and brave in the quietest way. He nodded once. You'll get it, he said. Together, they spent the fading light documenting everything, the broken fences, the tire marks that ran deep into the soil, the bright orange survey ribbons fluttering like open wounds in the wind. Linda filmed while Jonas flew his old drone, capturing footage of heavy machinery parked illegally past his boundary lines. The hum of the drone mixed with the rustle of trees, a modern testimony for an ancient kind of theft. Bear followed close, his paws sinking into the wet earth, his fur slicked dark with rain. Each time the wind shifted, he turned his head toward the ridge, ears pricked, sensing more than any human could. By the time they finished, night had rolled in, black, swollen, alive with the pulse of the coming storm. Inside, Linda reviewed the footage. On her small laptop screen, the trespass was undeniable. This, she said quietly, isn't just your fight anymore. Jonas poured her coffee and didn't respond. The truth had a way of expanding, spilling into corners you never meant to light. Outside, thunder grumbled. Bear lifted his head, growling low at the window, but Jonas waved it off until the phone rang. The call came from an unknown number. Jonas answered, expecting Avery. What came through instead was a whisper, fractured by static. Jonas, it's Ethan. The man's voice was jagged, panting. In the background, something slammed, a door or a fist. They know I talked. They're at my door. Then silence. A click. The line went dead. Jonas stared at the phone, the rain pounding harder against the windows. The world seemed to tilt slightly, a slow, inevitable slide toward danger. Linda looked up from her screen. What is it? He didn't answer. He was already on his feet. The keys jingled once as he grabbed them from the hook by the door. Bear barked once, short and sharp, already moving toward the truck. Jonas's boots hit the porch with purpose. The rain was coming down in sheets now, each drop reflecting flashes of distant lightning. He opened the driver's door, Bear leaping into the truck bed without hesitation. The engine turned over, coughing once before roaring to life. He didn't look back at the house or the porch light flickering in the storm. He just drove, the tires slicing through the mud, headlights carving a pale tunnel through the downpour. Behind him, thunder broke like cannon fire across the hills, chasing him down the narrow road. Somewhere ahead, a man who'd risked everything for the truth was calling for help. And Jonas Hale, soldier, rancher, and unwilling hero, wasn't the kind of man to ignore a cry like that. The storm swallowed them whole. The morning came soft and muted, a hush of gray light spilling over the courthouse steps. It was the kind of morning that smelled of rain and old wood, where every footstep seemed to echo through time itself. Inside, the air held the weight of history, dust, polish, and the ghosts of verdicts long past. Men in suits murmured, papers shuffled, and somewhere above it all, the ceiling fan turned slow and steady, like the rhythm of a tired heart. Jonas sat quietly at the defendant's table, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. His hat rested beside him, the brim worn smooth by years of sun and work. Across the aisle sat Karen Schilling, posture sharp, lips pressed into a shape too controlled to be calm. Her lawyers, two men in silk suits, leaned close, whispering in tones meant to sound confident but edged with nerves. Justice, it seemed, had its own kind of weather. Avery Collins rose. The lawyer's presence was unhurried, composed. He adjusted his glasses and let the silence linger for a breath before speaking. Then, the lights dimmed slightly as the footage began to play. On screen, Jonas Hale, steady, patient, standing before men who had trespassed on his land. No threats, no violence, just a man protecting what he'd been born into, the kind of ownership that wasn't inked on paper, but carved into the skin of generations. Each frame spoke louder than testimony. When the clip ended, the courtroom didn't breathe for a moment. Then came Ethan Brooks. The young man's hand trembled as he was sworn in, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. But his eyes were clear. He spoke of the forgery, the bribes, the threats, of nights spent watching emails vanish, files edited, names changed. His words were not loud, but they cut clean through the room, stripping away the polish of the lies. Karen's face tightened. For a moment the mask slipped, and what remained was fear, the kind born not of guilt, but of exposure. Avery didn't look at her. He simply let Ethan speak, the truth spilling out like light through a cracked door. When it was done, the judge, an older man with silver hair and eyes like tempered steel, leaned forward. His gavel came down once, hard. The sound cracked through the chamber like thunder on dry earth. Case dismissed, charges reversed. Fraud investigation opened. It was not shouted, it was simply said. But in that still courtroom, it felt like the sound of something breaking free after being buried too long. Outside, the storm had passed. The sky opened in brilliant defiance, sunlight spilling over the courthouse steps as if the world itself had been waiting for this. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust out, cameras flashing. Questions flew like birds startled from a field. Jonas paused at the top of the stairs, Bear waiting beside the truck below. He said only 5 words, calm, almost to himself. Truth wins eventually, always. And then he walked away. Later, that afternoon, the wind carried the scent of cedar back across the valley. Dust drifted through the open barn doors, settling over tools and memories. Jonas moved slowly through the house, quiet hands finding the old Remington where it had rested in the cabinet. He wiped the dust from its surface, one slow, deliberate motion, and placed it back again. The sound of the door closing was soft, final, like a book ending where it was always meant to. Outside, Bear waited at the gate, tail low, eyes bright. Jonas walked to him, resting a hand on the worn wood where everything had begun. The grain was rough under his palm, carved by time and weather, scarred yet solid. He stood there a long moment, listening. The world around him was silent, but alive. The rustle of grass, the whisper of wind through the pines, the faint creak of the gate in its hinge. And for the first time in a long while, the land seemed to breathe easier. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. It exhales, quietly, patiently, like a sigh of relief carried on the wind. And in that stillness between man and earth, between the truth and the silence it leaves behind, there was peace. Not the kind you win, the kind you earn. Sometimes, when the noise fades and the road turns quiet again, what stays isn't the battle. It's the heartbeat that carried us through it. We remember not the victories, but the small moments of courage that no one saw. A man choosing to stand when it would have been easier to walk away. A loyal companion who never asked why, only stayed. A kindness given without the promise of return. The world keeps spinning, loud and restless, and yet there are people, ordinary, steady people, who hold their ground in silence. They mend fences others broke, tell truths others bury, and love a land, a person, a cause, enough to keep trying. And maybe that's what heroism really is. Not the noise, not the medals, but the quiet that follows when someone has done the right thing, even when no one was watching. So if tonight the wind feels still, listen closely. Somewhere out there, another soul is keeping watch, loyal, brave, gentle, and because of them, the world holds together just a little longer.